Soren may have been chosen for the Spartan 2 program like many other 6-year-old children, but in a lot of ways, he was one of the most unique candidates that Dr. Halsey had selected. For one, he'd undergone a significant amount of mental trauma prior to his inscription thanks to the fact that his mother and stepfather had been killed by a planet-specific disease. He was seemingly more resourceful than many of the other children too, having survived on his guardian's farm alone until he'd consumed the food that had been stored on the property. He also had managed to bury both his mother and stepfather's bodies completely by himself. It was for this reason that Halsey wondered if he was even fit for the program at all. Though he had no family to miss him if he was gone, the amount of misery he'd surely felt at such a young age would leave deep mental scars that could, if unchecked, become infected and problematic later. With all of this in mind, instead of simply abducting Soren as she had with all of the children before him, she gave him a choice. Come with her to be a part of something difficult but better, or stay here and attempt to find a foster home. Soren was a smart kid, and though he surely couldn't have fully understood the gravity of the situation and the immense weight such a decision would have, he accepted. What Halsey didn't realize, a fact that Soren had no intention of sharing with her, was that his parents hadn't simply died of some sickness. The truth was far darker than that. His mother had become ill, and instead of immediately taking her to the hospital, Soren's stepfather decided to put it off. You see, his farm was growing an illegal crop, and he was afraid that bringing his wife to the hospital would attract unwanted attention. This foolish decision would end up costing Soren's mother her life, but before Soren could see that his mother had died, his stepfather scooped up her body and stuffed it away in a mostly unused room. He instructed Soren to never enter, stating that his mother needed time alone to heal and rest. One night, when his stepfather had too much to drink, Soren stole the key to the room containing his mother's body and entered. Once inside, the bitter truth was revealed to him. Though he was only 6, growing up on a remote farm in the wilderness had taught him plenty about death. He knew his mother was gone, and that this corpse in front of him was now merely an empty husk. Somehow, even at his age, he knew that his stepfather was at fault for his mother's death. This enraged him, and stricken with grief, he decided the man needed to pay. He quietly crept into the kitchen and grabbed a knife. The blade was the sharpest they own, something he determined by the fact that his mother had never allowed him to handle it without her help. Weapon in hand, he cautiously snuck into the room where his stepfather lay sleeping and positioned himself above the drunken man. Frightened, Soren sat there for a long time, weighing his options and planning an escape route if the knife somehow didn't make its way home. Finally, after much deliberation, Soren leapt onto his stepfather, using what little weight his body possessed to drive the blade as deeply into his neck as possible. Before he could react, Soren sprinted outside and into a nearby bush. His stepfather had survived the attack and hobbled outside in search of the child, occasionally calling out to him and explaining that whatever had happened, they could come to terms with it together. Soren either didn't believe him or didn't care, and instead of revealing himself, he stayed hidden. He spent a long time in the woods near his house, living off of bugs and berries. Each day, he would look to the building, see his stepfather within, and watch as he moved out to harvest his crops. As Soren analyzed his patterns and contemplated what to do, he noticed that his path was always the same. He thought about laying a trap to kill his stepfather, but one day realized he wouldn't need to. On this particular day, his stepfather emerged from their home looking sickly. He coughed blood and eventually became so exhausted from his work in the fields that he fell to the floor. Based on these symptoms, Soren determined his stepfather had the same sickness that had afflicted his mother before, and because of that, when he collapsed onto the ground, he thought the man might finally be dead. After quite some time, his stepfather finally stood and slowly made his way to his truck. Before he could get inside, he collapsed in the dirt once again. The man was dying, and Soren knew it, so he made his way out of the woods and towards him. Soren's stepfather quickly took notice of him and expressed relief to see him. He then explained that he was ill and desperately needed Soren's help. Soren had no intention of helping the man, though, and as he begged and pleaded, the boy simply ignored him. Soren waited a while until his stepfather went quiet, and eventually his breathing stopped. He moved back into the house after that, taking the time to bury his mother and even his stepfather in the soil of the farm. He existed in the home alone for a while before he concluded that there was no longer anything for him here, and so he set off into the woods towards what he believed to be a human settlement. It took him a long time to find civilization, and when he did, both his clothes and his body had become ragged from all the time spent living in the woods. He had made it, though, and was quickly scooped up by a concerned person. He remained in this town, speaking with many psychiatrists until Halsey had finally found him and collected him for the Spartan program. Thanks to the time he had spent on his own living in the harshness of nature, many of the training exercises he endured on Reach were easy and felt completely natural to him. Crawling through the mud, hiking through the forest, athletic obstacle courses, it was all simple compared to the time he'd spent alone and the guilt that had started to form over the years within him. Although the training challenges felt natural to him, being social usually didn't. He found himself attempting to simply disappear among the other recruits. He didn't want to be a leader, nor did he want to be an outsider, so he did his best to insert himself somewhere in the middle. In a way, to be as unremarkable as possible. The killing of his stepfather often haunted him now, and he would regularly battle with PTSD that was clearly caused by these events. For example, having bunkmates that he could hear while they slept triggered the memory of his stepfather's haggard inhales right before he died. He had developed a constant fear of being left behind, too, and these abandonment issues plagued him during each new exercise. When the time came for the children to undergo augmentations, Halsey pulled Soren aside and had him meet her in her office. Much like how she gave him the choice to come with her, she intended to present him with yet another decision. She explained to him the dangers of the augmentation process, how his body could reject the surgeries, how he could become deformed, unable to walk, or worse yet, die. She also explained what would happen if the procedures were a success, though. He'd be transformed into a superhuman with better reflexes, greater strength, and greater agility. She offered him the choice to either proceed with the augmentations or to deny them. His fear of abandonment resurfaced within him, so he simply said yes and that he didn't want to be left behind. Putting such a burden on a child his age and asking him to make a decision he clearly didn't fully understand was cruel, and Halsey knew it. She had only done it in a sad attempt to mitigate some of her own guilt. Unfortunately for her, giving Soren this choice only seemed to exacerbate her fears of the augmentation's potential failures. Not long after, Soren, along with all of the other soon-to-be Spartan 2s, were put under, and the augmentation procedures began. During this period, Soren had absolutely horrific dreams. In one, he was desperately running away from a large, seemingly inhuman creature that aimed to kill him. He sprinted through the woods for what seemed like forever until he came to a dead end, and the creature caught up with him. Without hesitation, it grabbed Soren and flung him through the trees. He landed on the ground, broken and battered, slowly dying. Everything within his vision became white as he started to wake up and take notice of the doctors around him. This brief moment of consciousness was short-lived, and he slipped back into yet another twisted dream state. In this one, he was immobilized in a bed. A door across from him opened, a shadowy version of his stepfather moved through, and it began to speak. No words came out of his mouth, though, and instead, all he heard was unintelligible sounds. He quickly realized he wasn't alone in the bed, feeling the presence of someone next to him, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't turn his head to see who it was. A zombie-like hand moved its way into his vision, and he realized that the person beside him was his mother. Thankfully, before things could progress any further, Soren began regaining consciousness once again. Unbelievable pain washed over him, almost completely blotting out his thoughts and sense of self. He quickly analyzed his environment and realized where he was and who the people around him were. He was restrained in a bed, and the people huddled around him were doctors. Due to the pain, he didn't think, he just reacted. He ripped at the straps that had been used to bind him and managed to break free. Any of the doctors that tried to stop him were quickly smacked away with ease, a fact that confused Soren greatly. Everyone seemed to be moving really slowly, as if they were in water. He grabbed a doctor's wrist, and the bones shattered beneath his grip with a loud and uncomfortable crack. His body moved strangely, everything was wrong, and a terrible pain that felt as though he had been filled with the burning of 1,000 suns overtook him. He ran down hallways, smashing through doors and into walls as the pain overwhelmed his senses. He rounded a corner, and at the end of the room was a group of Marines. Behind them was CPO Mendez, the man who had been assigned to instruct the Spartans during their training. Mendez ordered him to stop, and for a moment, he slowed, but the pain he felt quickly blotted out any rational thoughts he might have been able to conjure, and he ran past them. He almost got out of the facility, but was hit by several tranquilizer darts just before he made it. Halsey attempted to intervene, but it was too late. He could already feel himself slipping away. The pain was subsiding too, but just before he passed out, he was able to finally speak. He looked to Halsey and spoke only 6 words. "What have you done to me?" When he finally awoke, he found himself within a jail cell, titanium restraints holding his hands together. Suddenly, 2 Marines accompanied by Dr. Halsey entered the room. Once they stepped in, Halsey instructed the soldiers to leave, and begrudgingly, they did. She turned her attention to Soren, who was now completely deformed. One leg was mangled and twisted, and the fingers on one hand were bent into a crab-like claw. Halsey then sat in front of him and began speaking. She explained that certain parts of the procedure had failed, causing his body to be bent into a less than desirable shape. Though he had gained immense strength, even more than the Spartan 2s whose augmentations had worked properly, he was likely going to be in constant pain for the rest of his life. He had been in a coma for almost 3 months. When they took him off of life support, his heart stopped for 4 minutes before he finally awoke and began tearing through the facility. Everyone thought he was going to die, and he wished he had. Halsey apologized to him. She said she was sorry this happened, but instead of accepting the apology, he simply shifted the blame onto himself. He had made the decision, and because of that, he felt as though he was the only one to blame. As time went on, Soren became more and more accustomed to his body and the pain that he felt. He was prescribed heavy dosages of painkillers that dulled the aches within him, but whenever he took them, his mind became foggy. He found it hard to think, so he slowly began lowering his intake. He'd receive the meds, and instead of using them all, he'd simply store them in a drawer within his room. Eventually, he stopped taking them altogether. He was still always in pain, but at least his mind was clear. Despite his physical deformities, he was still incredibly strong and resilient. He was still a Spartan, and in his mind, he could still do his duty as such. He took this thought process to Mendez, explaining that even though his body was broken, he was still a more than capable soldier. To his credit, Mendez agreed, but somberly explained that Soren could never be part of a Spartan team. His broken body would remind his potential teammates of the loss of the other Spartans, and because of this, they may go out of their way to protect him to compensate for that feeling. This could throw off squad cohesion, weigh on their minds, and potentially put them in unwanted and unnecessary danger. Soren spoke to Halsey about this next, and much to Soren's chagrin, she agreed with Mendez. This devastated him, and he asked Halsey to please just allow him to choose to fight as she had done for him before. Given Mendez's reasoning, she felt that she just couldn't. And so he was assigned a supposedly temporary desk job, a run-of-the-mill task that literally anyone could do, and because of this, Soren felt as though his talents were being wasted. He felt resentful and angry, and as time went on, he started to believe he would be stuck in this pointless position forever. As he worked to complete mundane tasks, he became acquainted with a man simply named Parch. Parch talked a lot with Soren, slowly dropping hints that he didn't agree with the way the UNSC handled things. The more he talked to Soren, the more Soren found himself agreeing with what he had to say. Parch was right about a lot of things, and he seemed to sympathize with Soren, expressing confusion towards Soren's dead-end job and lost potential. It wasn't long until Parch had talked Soren into full-on rebellion and had convinced him to follow his lead. Together they aimed to steal something from inside the Spartan training facility, but whatever it was, Parch wouldn't say. They made their way into a room and managed to pry open a cabinet to retrieve whatever was inside. Before they could leave, another Spartan too confronted them. This particular Spartan was Randall, and though Soren didn't know him all that well, they were both Spartans all the same. Using this connection as a sort of leverage, Soren attempted to smooth-talk him a bit. Randall wasn't falling for it, though, and insisted that they come with him to make sure that Soren and Parch were sanctioned to be doing whatever it was he'd caught them doing. Soren lunged at Randall and wrestled with him for a few moments, attempting to render him unconscious, when suddenly he went limp. Soren assumed he was faking it to throw him off, but Parch had simply hit him with some kind of sedative. With Randall unconscious, the two of them made their way to the base's airfield, where Parch claimed to have a ride for them to get out of there. The two men quickly made their way to the aircraft as sirens began to ring out across the complex. Once they arrived at the airfield, they quickly hopped into a longsword and took off, but additional aircraft had come up on their flank before they could even make it out of the atmosphere. They hailed Soren and Parch, warning them to stop and land, but before they got the chance to respond, their pursuers began firing at them. The first few shots intentionally missed and served as warnings, but one eventually made its mark and the vehicle began to rapidly descend. Soren took control of the steering mechanism and slowly maneuvered the plane towards a forest, easing it down as gently as he possibly could. He miscalculated slightly and clipped a tree, causing him to lose what little bit of control he still possessed. Parch was screaming before, but had suddenly gone silent, and when Soren turned to look at him, he saw why. At some point during their descent, his neck had broken and he sat in his seat dead, but Soren remained conscious. The rapidly deteriorating cockpit of the aircraft tumbled and rolled into the forest, pieces flying off in all directions around Soren. Recovery teams were quickly dispatched to the crash site, and despite how hard they looked, they were only able to find one body. Mendez went to the site himself, and as far as he could tell, the corpse, which had been charred beyond recognition, wasn't Soren's. He returned to Halsey with the news, and the two of them mulled everything over. Had Soren survived the crash and made his way into the woods? Mendez doubted it, but Halsey, on the other hand, did not. Soren was likely still alive and well, somewhere out in the forests of Reach. Mendez then suggested that they continue to search for him, as he could potentially be a threat one day, but Halsey told him not to pursue it. She claimed that he wouldn't be a problem for them, and that regardless of how hard they looked, they'd never be able to find him anyways. Had she called off the search because she truly believed he wasn't going to be an issue, or had her guilt finally influenced this decision? Perhaps, and most likely, it was a combination of the two. Mendez exited her office and left her alone to ponder her actions. Should she have conscripted him into the Spartan program at all? Should she have ever given him a choice? It didn't matter now. Soren was gone. Soren's fate is unclear, but if you ask me, I'd say it's pretty obvious that he survived. Did he finally leave the planet to join a group of rebels, or did he go on to live alone in a cabin of his own creation somewhere in the forest? And if he did, what did he do when the Covenant finally arrived to Glass Reach? Perhaps Soren survived even that, finding a cave from which to live out the rest of his days. Maybe, just maybe, he's alive even now, still hiding, yet to become one of the many ghosts of Reach. Soren's story is a depressing look at a somehow even uglier side of the Spartan 2 program. And though the events of his life were radically changed for the TV series, I am glad he was included to at least shine a light onto one of the most dark and tragic stories in the Halo universe. Alright, thanks for watching. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm gonna go play some Halo.